Hello, 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 and I thank you for visiting. Today I'm going to be talking about the art of writing counter arguments in your essay. Hopefully this will give you a lot of food for thought and be kind of fun. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now and get started talking about adding counter arguments to your argumentative essay. So, you never want to write an argumentative essay without counter arguments. It would be extremely odd for a college professor to tell you, no, 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 don't consider any other sides of the argument. So let's always assume that you need to include counter arguments. So what we do is we present our argument, we present somebody else's argument that's different, so that's called the counter argument. And then when we strike down their counter argument, we call that a rebuttal. So just to review, in case that wasn't clear or familiar. So a rebuttal is our argument against another's counter argument. So one way to do this well is look for a logical fallacy in their argument, right? So if you're talking about um, doing away with the death penalty, right? And they're talking about keeping the death penalty. Well, does another murderer compensate for or undo one, right? So that's a good rebuttal to that argument. You want to look for study design flaws, right? So if you've got another topic that you're looking at, a really good one is we like to compare America to Sweden when we're talking about education. We say we wish we could do it more like the Swedes. Well, we can't. Um, the country of Sweden is like the size of one of our small states. It's extremely homogeneous, and so all the people are mostly same ethnicity, same religion, speak the same language, right? Live under the same sort of circumstances as far as class and whatnot. So when you think about all of the differences that students in America bring to the educational system, you really cannot compare those. So look for those types of flaws. Next, think about bias. This is something that we see a lot. We see it a lot in pharmaceutical research when there's some sort of an article published about the efficacy of a medication, right? Talking about all of the miracles it can work. And then if you look at the really, really fine print at the end of the article, you find that the authors are employees of the pharmaceutical company or paid by the pharmaceutical company. And that is never bueno, right? Not a good idea to have someone who will gain monetarily for promoting this product, have that person involved in designing and investigating and summarizing the study. Not a good idea. So those are three main ways I would always look at rebutting a counter argument, and we'll continue on. So let's take this idea of thinking about arguing against the death penalty. One thing I can do to make sure that I tell my reader, right, and my teacher that I'm going to address counter arguments is to have it directly stated in the thesis statement. So I might say, even though some argue the death penalty can give justice to grieving families of murder victims, I argue that the death penalty is too expensive, causes innocent people to die, and forces healthcare providers to violate their professional oaths. Now look at how this has got three prongs, right? And I said, I don't like that three-pronged thesis statement. But it's not so simple because it has that counter-argument element right there in the beginning. And so you can see this could develop a very long essay. So you've got one specific counterargument that the essay will explore and rebut or negate, right? So you're not expecting to see other counterarguments. You can embed the counterargument directly in the introduction in a sentence other than the thesis statement. So we've got the death penalty is too expensive, causes innocent people to die, forces healthcare providers to violate their oath, and then another sentence that says, understandably, right, the families of murder victims see the death penalty as a form of justice, yet retribution only does more harm. So I've got this idea that I'm going to flesh out this counter argument, but it doesn't have to be in my thesis statement per se, as long as I've got it in my introduction. My reader knows that I do plan on investigating this argument in a balanced sort of way. So little note at the bottom. And then I can embed it implicitly in the introduction, right? So I've got this idea that in the one in the middle, I'm telling you explicitly what counter argument I plan to rebut. Now we'll take a look at this one. The death penalty is too expensive, causes innocent people to die, yada, yada, yada. And then I didn't put this in bold because it's implicit. We've got this sentence that says, while some make fairly convincing arguments to the contrary, the risks of employing the death penalty in the US outweigh the benefits. So this would also allow me to write a longer essay. I'm telling the reader I'm going to look at different counter arguments. Those are arguments to the contrary and rebut them. And so it leaves lots of space to explore that. It's going to make a longer essay. And we'll also start to consider the type of audience with whom we're dealing and how we wish to navigate the inclusion of counter arguments. Okay, so one way of doing this is just to alternate arguments with counter arguments, and you've got this sort of like back and forth, okay? And that's fine. One way of writing this essay is to start with counter arguments and then do your arguments. And so you see, you start with the counter argument, and then we've got the argument, and the whole essay would sort of be organized like that, where I have a paragraph about a counter argument, a paragraph about an argument, and then I could have an essay where I've got a paragraph with an argument, and then a paragraph with a counter argument. What I want you to look at are those notes near the top. So if you start an essay, and this applies to public speaking, all sorts of communication, letter writing, anything, if you start your piece with a counter argument, this is what we do when an audience is what we call a hostile audience. Doesn't mean they're necessarily going to be throwing their shoes at you, but you know, this is my go-to example. Is it's your job to make a speech to convince a small town in Utah to vote yes on this late term abortion bill, right? And so you're thinking about your population who's largely going to belong to the Church of Latter-day Saints, who's largely going to oppose abortion. You know, if you just walk up onto that stage and say, hey, everybody, I have this great idea. Why don't you vote yes on this measure? Your people are probably just going to walk out. But you know, if you start by conceding to them that you understand their point of view, you understand their counter argument here, this counter argument, and then come in with your argument. That's the way we start to win over a hostile audience. Is you call it concession. So I concede that you argue this, right? Allow me to argue this. And then over here on the right, when we just start with our argument, we just do this when we've generally got a receptive audience. We're not too worried about how they're going to accept our argument. We just want to appear well-informed, educated, and balanced when we're presenting our argument. So those are some considerations. So what would an essay look like that's using this sort of balanced and alternating design with arguments and counter-arguments? Well, we have our introductory paragraph with our thesis statement here. And so now paragraph 1 should address the costly appeals process, the cost of incarceration and euthanasia. And that's because the very first thing the student wrote was too expensive. So again, I'm grading your essay and I'm saying, oh, first part of this essay must be talking about cost because that was the first thing their thesis statement mentioned, right? So you can start to see the pattern and see what happens next. Well, what are some, counter arguments to this, and how is the student rebutting that? Next, innocent people can die, right? Innocent people are convicted and killed with the death penalty. And so that was the second point that you said you would address. And so now let's see the counter argument and your rebuttal for that. And next, this part about healthcare providers violating their oaths. I expect you to touch on that next. Then maybe you've got a counter argument. Maybe people with different job titles that didn't take that oath can fulfill the role. And now, how do you rebut that? How do you shoot down that idea? And so, with a conclusion, you better bring your best points in this order on cost, innocent, and oath, right? And refer back to, I like these words, risk and benefits. Echo that language in your conclusion. And so that's what I'm looking for. Same with counter arguments and then arguments. Because your thesis statement started with a counter argument, now I expect your first paragraph to be that counter argument about justice and grieving families. And then, you bring in the research to rebut that. And then next, you can have a transition paragraph, and we'll talk about what those look like at a later date. But you take the time to sort of wrap up that one idea and transition into another. And you've definitely got to have next expense, the death of innocent people, the oaths of healthcare providers, and because that's what you promised me. So your thesis statement really promises me the organizational model of your essay. Your whole introduction really promises me how you're going to organize the essay. So don't forget that. And lastly, if you wanted to start with the arguments first, it's just the sort of the inverse of what we just saw. So you can start with expenses, you can go through wrongfully convicted innocent people being euthanized, healthcare providers violating their oaths. And here I broke this down just to show you how you can make it longer than 5 paragraphs. There are physicians who sometimes do this. There are RNs who are sometimes involved. And now your counter argument, and now you rebut that counter argument, right? That is there a difference between justice and retribution? And then you can conclude. So this three-pronged thesis statement, once you've included a counter argument and you've broken down some of its various components, really you can see 7, 8 paragraphs arising from that thesis statement. So don't get stuck in that 5-paragraph rut. Okay, so lastly, I want to talk about avoiding either or argumentation. Way too often, people get stuck in this argument that it's either got to be this way or this way. There's only this or this, right? If you don't vote for me, then you're voting for that. Well, not necessarily. So let's take a look at this. It was a really controversial topic about 10 years ago when I was starting to teach. And I'm known for being a social justice advocate. And some of my students were shocked when I said what I said, and I'll explain it. So we might think we've got this argument where I either want to argue that gay marriage should be legal or I want to make gay marriage illegal, right? So I think, oh, I've got this big binary, like it's either this or this, right? Not always. So some people might argue that gay people deserve the same constitutional rights as straight people. Some people might argue that there's this thing about nature that gay people are going against, right? So we go back and forth. One problem with the argument there comparing gays to straights is that you make straight people the norm or like the golden standard. So not particularly ideal. One problem you've got in the other argument about nature is that actually in nature itself, you have myriad sexualities and relationships. And you run the risk of comparing humans to animals, then that's really a slippery slope, because we like to think that we have higher, brain function and a sort of moral or ethical or civic code that animals don't have. So it's a really tricky argument. You could have this argument that if you legalize gay marriage, it gives gay couples greater opportunities for adopting children. But there's a counter argument to that. And then we could say gay people procreate less frequently, so the population will decline if gay people can marry. Hopefully, you can already start to see these counter arguments. So counter argument to this adoption issue is that you can change adoption laws without changing marriage laws. And then you've got this counter argument to the population decline. um, you know, Making gay marriage illegal doesn't force gay people to marry straight people. It doesn't mean that gay people will go and make babies. So it's just a complete logical fallacy that you'll have a population decline, because whether or not gay marriage is legal won't change the number of people who are gay. So now this is the important part. It's not just an either or argument. And so I remember telling my students, no, I don't think gay marriage should be legalized. And they looked at me, like I was the devil incarnate, didn't understand where I was coming from. And I showed them, because this is not an either or situation. I said, I don't think the government should have anything to do with marriage. Historically, it was religious, and I frankly just don't understand why there are any laws surrounding it. To me, it's religious. If you're not religious, it's definitely a cultural institution. And so then, I said I just don't see why there are laws surrounding marriage in general, period. And I just reminded the students this doesn't have to be an either or. Now, do I want everyone to have the same rights? Of course, yeah. That's not, the issue. I was just pointing out to them the fact that it doesn't have to be either or. You can really think outside the box and think of other options that could arise. As we saw in that example about the snowmobiling in Yellowstone National Park, maybe it's not a ban that should be implemented, but just stricter restrictions, right? Um, and then another point is that if you keep talking about this gay, straight, you're assuming that everybody's either female or male, gay or straight, and it's ignoring a lot of the population who's intersex, gender creative, or something like bisexual, pansexual, gender fluid, and all of that. So I just think it's a shame that we get stuck in this either or argument about things that people hold so near and dear to their heart. So, final note, if you think an argument is a binary, either this or that, think again, it never is. And so assume that you need a counter argument. Always write a counter argument. Pretend you're arguing for the other side. So, funny story, I'll keep it brief. As an undergraduate, I was an ignorant student, and I thought I wanted to write this argument in a women's studies class that breastfeeding was kind of like icky and something women shouldn't be doing in public. And what our instructor did was go around and look at each of the arguments we had written down, and then said, now write the counter argument. So we wrote the counter, wrote the opposite argument, and she would say, now that's your topic, go write it. And it forever changed my view. It really did. Having to explore the idea of public breastfeeding as a women's right issue, and knowing that I had to make a convincing argument for it, it actually changed my mind about the whole topic. So go for it. Don't hold back. When you're looking for counter arguments, dig for them and allow them to change your mind, or even allow them to just somewhat temper or alter your argument. You'll end up with something more balanced and more nuanced, and something you'll be happy to share. And rebut counter arguments. Look for flawed logic, look for flawed research, research design. look for flawed findings, look for bias, right? And your teachers can help you look for these as well. So I hope this was fun for you. I enjoy looking at your arguments, which will have counter arguments in them, and we will talk again soon. Thank you very much, and I hope you all have a great day.